Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? Well, you're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support, and they're helping enterprises slash cost by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7, 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 companies and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is the smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started today. That's uscloud.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well as we continue to plow through May, almost June, almost halfway through the year. I guess not halfway through the year, 5 out of 12, but getting there. Hope everybody's doing well. It's starting to warm up in many parts of the world. Here in North Carolina, it's starting to warm up, and in some cases, really, really warm. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. I want to dive into a topic. One of the things that we oftentimes ask for on the show is, we will talk about topics. Oftentimes the topics are, sort of at the bleeding edge of things. I think we've sort of laid that out pretty well for the show. We don't tend to just sort of cover the news. We don't sort of just tend to cover the mainstream of things. We tend to sort of be a little bit on the cutting edge. I don't want to say the bleeding edge. We sort of tend to look at things and technologies that are maybe a couple of years out, year plus. We're sort of trying to talk to people who are, involved with new things. And but one of the things we always ask for is, hey, if you've got any feedback on the show, if you think we're right, we're wrong, any of those things, we'd love to hear feedback. And this week, we didn't get direct feedback. But we got sort of indirect feedback. Somebody who listens to the show and has sent us feedback in the past decided to write an article, write a kind of a Substack sort of blog about their take on sort of where we are with AI, where we are with kind of being hyped as an industry. How realistic are some of the bold statements that are being made about this stuff. And it was an interesting article, and kind of laid out their perspective on things based on some real world engagement they had done with AI, and some skepticism about whether it was far along as whether it was how we portray it on the show or others have portrayed it. And I thought I wanted to kind of dive into it, not so much as just agree or disagree with the article, but I thought it did bring up a couple of really interesting points about how we as humans, as whether we look at it as engineers or we look at it as just human beings, are kind of looking at, postulating, determining where we think the role of AI will be in work, and where we think the role of humans will be, and where the interactions will be between the two of them. And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to dig into that, and we'll dig into that right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by Vasion. Print is one of the biggest drains on IT resources, but did you know there's an easy solution? Just eliminate print servers. They're resource intensive and likely the bane of your IT team's existence. Vasion Print, formerly known as Printer Logic, lets you simplify infrastructure and maximize resources by replacing print servers with direct IP serverless print. Reduce attack surfaces and secure your environment while still enjoying cloud-native flexibility that easily supports a hybrid workforce. Less complexity, less headaches, and less time wasted. And with built-in AI and automations, it's a solution that just works. See for yourself by scheduling a demo at vasion.com. That's VASION.com. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we had a chance to be mentioned in a Substack article, in a blog post, if you will. Just an opinion on the internet, whatever we want to call those these days. A gentleman by the name of Matt Reeder, who is somebody who I believe has listened to the show for a while. I know Matt sent us feedback a number of times. Matt is a product manager at Dynatrace. Dynatrace, great company. Not an ad for them, not a sponsor, but great company in the telemetry observability monitoring space. So Matt's somebody who has given us feedback on the show for many, many years. We always appreciate it. In some cases, good. In some cases, bad. But exactly the way we ask for feedback on the show. And one of the things that Matt has done over the past couple of weeks is he wrote an article in which he sort of dove into his perspective on a little bit on the hype of AI, which obviously I think we've all sort of experienced that there's quite a bit. I've had a number of shows on here where, I've sort of questioned the viability of some of the claims of some of the leading edge AI people, and they may have far greater vision than myself, and some of these things may come to fruition, which may or may not be a great thing. But I think we've tried to find some balance between sort of the hype of AI, which having been around the industry for a long time. Every new trend, especially a very new era, a sort of revolutionary part of the era, tends to be led with hype. Possibilities. I think there's a reason why so many of the engineers that work in our industry are drawn to our industry, because not because of the hype, but because the possibility of what could be created is appealing to them. And if you told them, well, the only thing that's ever going to get created is only going to look forward 2 years, most people would in our industry would probably go, oh, well, that doesn't seem so terribly interesting. I'm thinking about something I might do for my career for the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. And so, I think hype is a natural part of it. But I think skepticism about that hype is, also a natural part of our industry. It's part of, what makes engineers, right? They are both, willing to work on things that have never existed to try and create them. And at the same time, they are inherently skeptical about, whether or not certain things that may not, fit their eye, fit their perspective are going to be realistic. Right. And so everywhere in between is sort of, where we live in this industry. So anyways, wrote an article, basically sort of said, began by calling out, hey, I think there's some overhype in the AI industry. He happened to call out, one of our shows is saying, hey, you guys are talking about things as if, this new agentic stuff is already here. And, again, you can argue whether or not that's true. I think there's probably, some early adopter cases in which some of that's true. And there's a lot of, things that are still to come. But that's not really the point of this article, or this show. I'm not kind of questioning what Matt laid out. But anyways, so he goes into that, and that's fine. But then what he does is he lays out a couple of examples of things that he had worked on, and the point of everything that he was writing about, and I think this is a perspective I hear from a lot of engineers, is it turns the what the future of AI is going to look like into sort of a binary thing, right? Like it's either going to be all capable, or it's not going to be all capable. And I don't know whether this is an engineer's perspective or whether this is kind of the industry as a whole tries to, not tries to, but ends up summarily making everything into sort of a binary thing, right? Like AI is either going to be AGI or super AGI or whatever, or it's not. And I think the reality is, like with every technology, it doesn't replace all the old technology, and it doesn't live up to all the hype of, what it was supposed to do, right? That's sort of the reality of every technology that has come before AI, and probably will be the reality of every technology that comes after AI, at least in the enterprise space. Maybe not so much in the consumer space, because things do get replaced. But so he kind of walks through this thing, and one of the things that he sort of calls out, and this is the sort of key point of his thing, is even the AI that we have today, which is maybe amazing and super advanced, or maybe it's very rudimentary for where it's going to go in the future. Who knows? But he sort of says, it's only going to be able to replace sort of some basic level capabilities. It's not going to be able to replace sort of intermediate and advanced capabilities, because the last 5% of all of that is so difficult to get right, so difficult to get accurate, so difficult to have enough context and domain expertise that there will always need to be humans in the loop, right? And that's sort of his claim. And then he walks through, he kind of walks through a number of examples, both some personal projects that he's worked on, but also some things that he's been involved with in terms of managing projects that his companies have tried to put into the marketplace. And what I thought was interesting about it was, and this may not have been his intention, but it sort of is the way that it reads. And I don't mean to call out Matt in particular. I mean to call out kind of our industry as a whole, because I think we have a tendency to sort of make everything kind of binary. Binary is a human going to remain in the loop, or is this system going to completely replace things? And I think we sort of haven't yet figured out a framework, a mental framework, or an economic framework, an accountability framework to sort of describe, you know, the shades of gray between, fully autonomous and, augmenting in a human in the loop. Right. I don't think we've really kind of grasped what that looks like. But he had an interesting sort of anecdote, and I'll go ahead and read the anecdote. There's a link in the show notes. You can read the full article. But he basically said, at a previous startup, I led a team of engineers. Our challenge was delivering instant results without mistakes that could directly harm people's lives. So you go, okay, so the intention of the project was to make a system that, did an autonomous action. It delivered very fast results, and those results were so important. Life and death, they essentially, could harm people's lives, or, you could think about this as maybe they're even life or death types of things, right? I don't know. But, if you think about, harm people's lives, some sort of, bad thing for individuals. Our engineering team built an AI neural network to evaluate probability matches between public records and user profiles. The system performed as well as humans for 95% of cases while providing instantaneous results. So system was great up to 95% instantaneous results, which, as he said previously, was one of the really important parts of the system that has to be really fast. This met our business requirements for rapid turnaround and made our customers happy. So you look at that and you sort of read through that and you go, for most situations, like, that sounds like a win, right? I think, if you said, hey, we're going to get 95% great accuracy, it's very fast, and people are happy with it, right? You would say that's a win. And you could probably, maybe that's not a win for, nuclear systems. Maybe that's not a win for, beyond sort of, the pushing the button for nuclear war. You kind of go, okay, show me an industry that 5% isn't, I don't want to say the margin of error, but that level of mistakes happen. So automobile accidents happen. Problems happen when doctors have surgery. The rockets launch, to go into space, and we think about, we literally talk about rocket scientists, right? Like, rockets crash. And I don't know that they're all 5%, but 5% is sort of stuff happens, right? And we don't get things 100% accurate, whether it's logging, something as simple as logging into, your email, it fails part of the time, or whatever it might be. So anyways, my point isn't to argue the 5% thing, is that, for 95%, and maybe the thing needs to be 99.99% or 5 nines, whatever it is. But there's a level of mistake that happens. So then he says, he goes on, he says, for the remaining 5% of cases, the system was hit or miss, right? Meaning, I guess, sometimes it was right, sometimes it was wrong. And, in AI terms, that 5% represents our confusion matrix, instances where the AI couldn't confidently determine the answer. We ensured human review for each of these cases, despite 2 years of intense efforts. We never reduced the confusion rate below 5%. And, he said people still working on this project are still struggling with that. And so let's say of the 5%, those had to be reviewed by humans. And let's say of the 5%, half of those got resolved correctly, or maybe 80% got resolved correctly. Who knows? But I think what we get into is the perspective that, what should we do in this case? And I think this is a perfectly logical case of, we built a system as good as we could to be as autonomous as possible. But we also determined this was the level of mistakes. And because of that, we then, invoked a sort of secondary expert, in this case, a human, into the loop that had more domain expertise, more experience in these, whether they're corner cases or gray cases, or, however they want to be explained. We invoked a secondary type of thing. And that's fair, and that's fine. And I think what I get to with all this is I sort of look through all these, and I guess the question I had a bunch of questions, like, what do we think AI systems are capable of, right? And maybe the starting point there is, we should start with, what do we think smart systems are capable of, and not necessarily start with what Sam Altman thinks or what the CEO of Anthropic thinks or whatever, but, like, given our business, given any task, what do we think a smart system could figure out, right? Do we have a repeatable set of things that happen in our business? Is there a clean set of data that works? What could something do? The flip side of that is, what do we think human systems should be capable of? Humans in the loop, what are they capable of? Because the answer to that's not 100%. No matter what activity you work on, there isn't a 100% human type of thing, right? So we're somewhere in between those as starting points. I think I don't want to call it a fallacy, but I think the inclination a lot of times is when we say, well, we're going to compare the humans to the AI, and we put it in the context of somebody's individual job. I think people tend to think, well, I do a great job. I get things 100% right. Or I think I'm really good at my job. Now, maybe not 100% right, but you get them right. But I don't think we ever necessarily, at least individually, ever put a number mentally on how good you are. I think you just have it in your mind that, I'm really good at my job. I've gotten promoted. I've been in this job for a long time. I've done this for a while. People come and ask me for questions. But, there's nothing next to your name in the company directory that says, Brian Gracely, 93%, right? Or 95% or 97% or 81% or whatever the heck it is. And quite honestly, if we're being honest with ourselves, like the way that we grade people, in which we have top 10% and top 25% and sort of the middle percent, the normal bell curve that HR would look at it, you'd probably have a lot of people that are like, no, Steve Jones, 73%, Tom Jones, 74%. And you'd be like, wow, that doesn't seem very good. But you're like, well, that's sort of the middle. That's sort of average, right? Anyway, so I throw those out there. I think we know how to quantify error, but I don't know if we really, depending on what the role is, what the job is, what the stakes are, I don't know that we really know how to quantify error, because, what you would do in theory is you would go, okay, I have a mechanism for measuring error, right? And the error rate is whatever, right? So we know how to do that in things like manufacturing. If we're looking at things moving down the manufacturing line, does it look like it's supposed to look? Or, if we're doing mathematical calculations, we can figure out where there's errors, or, there's lots of things where you can figure out errors. But, for anybody who's worked in IT and systems and stuff, we talk about things like 99% uptime, 99.9% uptime, and multiple levels of nines. And then you sort of go, well, why are you paying for that extra 9 or that 0.9%? And, the answer is frequently and oftentimes, well, we can't have an outage. Or you'll say, well, how much does an outage cost? And, an outage cost, $1 million a minute, or, $500,000 a second, or whatever it is. And so we have to sort of measure around that. And in some cases, you can find companies who can do that, but I don't think that necessarily happens for the vast majority of things, right? I think we if you're talking about life and death situations, maybe, right? Like put your thumbprint on this scanner, and if the scanner doesn't work, like in Mission Impossible movies, it's just going to, immediately evaporate you, and you become like spontaneously combust, like the drummer in Spinal Tap. But that doesn't happen in most cases. Most use cases aren't life and death, and so I think we struggle to say that, hey, you can't have any errors, or the error rate has to be really low. But I don't know that we necessarily, on a day-to-day basis, on a use case by use case basis, know necessarily what an error is costing us, what we're willing to pay for errors or lack of errors, right? And, I think it's an interesting conversation. And I think it's an interesting conversation, especially as we get into engineers talking about the systems. And I only bring it up because of engineers, because for so many years, we've kind of had this yin and yang relationship, this back and forth swinging of the pendulum, when engineers put themselves in the middle of discussions about, whether or not, what they do, right? Because on one hand, people have written books and sort of glorified the engineer, the software engineer, software is eating the world, and software, developers are the new kingmakers, and those sort of things. So we sort of glorify them. We talk about 10x engineers and all that sort of nonsense about how amazing they are. At the same time, there's always the ongoing, well, developers are lazy. They don't like to do things. They'll automate stuff. They don't want to be bothered with certain things. And then we sort of get into this, well, we should keep humans in the loop. We should always have humans in the loop. Well, developers are also the first people to sort of be like, well, I don't really like dealing with humans, right? Like, I don't like going to meetings. I don't like interacting with call centers. I don't like, and it's, essentially them saying like, I don't like dealing with dumb humans. I just want to deal with smart humans. Well, again, quantify what that means for me, right? So I think we have an inherent tendency to put quantification around systems that we don't like, or systems that we fear, systems that we don't want to engage with. But I think we make, more than anything, kind of coming back to Matt's original article, and the reason I'm doing the show today is I think we have a really hard time when things aren't binary, when they're not 1 or 0, when they're not, it's in the loop, humans involved or humans not involved. And I think the reality, and I think his example is a great example of this, is, there are going to be all sorts of shades of gray, from 1% human augmentation to 99% or even 100% human augmentation. Well, let's just go between 1 and 99. And I don't think we really have a way to talk about that, because I think, again, we oftentimes talk about sort of replacement, right? Full autonomy. And I think we don't really have a mental framework, an economic framework, a other framework to sort of, have a realistic conversation. And I don't just mean like, some super high end kind of thing. I mean, one in which you can sit down as a technical person with a business person and have a realistic framework that both of you can talk about, or a group of people can talk about, in which you are sort of living somewhere between the 1% and the 99%. And I think it's going to be very interesting as more and more organizations begin to look at AI, and they look at it for multiple use cases across their organization, because that's what's happening, whether you're talking about, chatbots or agents or, whatever the thing might be. I think there is a huge opportunity for people to have a more kind of robust framework, a robust way of having conversations, just like we do for, things like budget planning, or, any sort of allocation that we have in terms of going, like, we have a finite amount of this and we want to cover these different things, whether it's prioritization or budget planning, or, determining who gets, raises or not gets raises. Like, we have frameworks there in which we sort of go, well, we're going to live between the 1% and the 99%. We're not talking about, 0 and 100. And I think for AI, we still mentally sort of live in this world of 0 or 100. And even when we are between 1 and 99%, and we're talking about human augmentation, I go back to this example that Matt has, and I don't mean to call it out as if it's some terrible thing, but it's a kind of a perfect example, right? Like, somebody built a system that is 95% makes customers happy, and the other 5%, the system may be getting it right. Right. It may by itself be getting it right, but you're not totally sure of it. So maybe the system in that case is 98% accurate. And the other 2% is human augmentation. So maybe it's not even 5%. But then the question becomes like, well, okay, what should the human augmentation be? Right. And, maybe the other question should be like, well, if there was more human augmentation in this stuff, like, is that last 5% really high value? Like, is there maybe another level of value that we could bring to this thing? And anyways, I look at all this stuff, and I think we're still in such early stages of thinking about AI, adopting AI, not adopting AI, seeing how the technology evolves, that, the answer to this, which I think does feel somewhat binary, is not really the answer, but it's the guidance on this, is you can be very sort of negative. You can be very deferential to it. And I don't want to do this. I wish we could go back to the old days. I really like those old days better. I hate that we have to deal with all this stuff. And that's fine. But I think the reality is, like, the fact that we're even having starting points that are 95%, lend itself towards, that's kind of where people are going to go. And again, how much they augment versus how much they replace, I think is going to be on a use case by use case basis. But I'm seeing more and more this very clear divide between people and groups and companies who are like, we are going to embrace this stuff. It seems to have a lot of benefits. We understand there's still a lot of learning to do, and groups and teams and people who are like, I am going to sort of live in the, I don't like the idea of it. I don't want to deal with it. And, there's a very distinct chance that sort of decision is going to sort of leave them behind. And again, so this whole point of this weekend perspective is not to sort of tell you, hey, you need to be all on board or you need to not be on board. But I do think it's, I'm seeing more and more situations in which I don't know that we've quite even begun to think about what a framework looks like for, what success with AI looks like. And I think we are getting ourselves too hung up with trying to be defensive about, say, the 5%, the 2.5%, whatever that might be, or whatever. And I understand it. Like we have engineers have a tendency oftentimes to sort of be like, I'm going to go find the negative use cases and I'm going to try and adapt to those and so forth. And that's not a knock on engineers. It's just the way that they're wired to make sure that the system works well. But I do think it's really interesting that we just, again, I come back to, I think this use case is very indicative of a way of thinking about things, but I also think it's as much indicative of that we haven't figured out yet a different way to think about it. Less binary, more gray, more somewhere in the spectrum of 1 to 99, and start to realize that the thing that people kind of have to figure out is, how are you going to have the conversation between your technical people and your business people, again, because somebody's going to pay for it, somebody's going to build it, and then somebody's going to have to live with the results of it, which the results are going to be far, far reaching. They're going to, touch your internal customers, your external customers. They're going to touch other teams that might interact with the system. I think that's the bigger thing that we ought to be trying to figure out what that is. And I don't know what the answer to that is yet. I haven't, quite started thinking about it, but I do think this is a great example of we get frustrated because we don't have the tools, the languages, the frameworks to speak of it any other way than sort of, augment versus replace, get defensive if you're on the human side of things versus the machine things, because we've seen stuff like Skynet or whatever it is. And I think the answer is in reality going to be very much somewhere in the middle. But we haven't figured out what that middle looks like yet. So anyways, I appreciate Matt writing the article. I appreciate him calling us out. Like I said, I appreciate anybody who, wants to, give us feedback, tell us we're full of crap, any of those sort of things, because we're, again, trying to figure a lot of this stuff out as well. But I think the more I thought about his article, I never sort of took offense to it. I never tried to be defensive thinking about him calling us out for it. But I did sort of, the more I thought about the article, the more I thought, I think we do need, I think there is opportunity for people to create a way to think about this and to better yet explain it and represent it than we are today. And I think that's very indicative of something that is, literally like less than 2 or 3 years, I guess 3 years old now, less than 3 years old, right? Come Thanksgiving, ChatGPT will be, roughly 3 years old. So anyways, I appreciate Matt's feedback. I appreciate him writing these things out. I appreciate him, whether he did it consciously or subconsciously, sort of getting me to think about things a little bit bigger and broader. And, again, would love to hear your feedback on that thought. If you've been working on this at all, if this is something that, is you've run into as a struggle, love to hear your feedback on that. So we'll keep the loop going. Anyways, with that, I thank you all for listening. Thank you all for telling a friend about the show, helping us grow the community, being part of the community. We really, really appreciate it. Hope you've got things coming up for June and July. Maybe those are vacations, and spend some time with friends and family, whether that's, kids graduating from everything from kindergarten to college or somewhere in between. But hope things are going well for you. And thanks for listening. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.